the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. 5,000 years of wisdom on demand. Get your first month for only 99 cents. Visit Gaia.com/Jim. That's Gaia.com/Jim to see what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. Thanks, Gaia. The Paranormal Podcast is also brought to you by Wink. Wink is offering our audience members who are 21 and over and who live in the U.S. a $20 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. For a free bottle of wine with your order, go to trywink.com/Jim. That's TRYWINC.com/Jim. Thanks, Wink.
This is the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold.
Welcome to the Paranormal Podcast. I am Jim Harold and so glad to be with you once again. And we have a humdinger of a show for you today. We've got the two Nicks on the show. I'm talking about Nick Redfern and Nicholas Pearson. And they're going to be talking about their respective areas of expertise. Nick Redfern's going to start off the festivities talking about his new book, The Roswell UFO Conspiracy. And in part two, return guest Nicholas Pearson will join us to talk about crystals for karmic healing. And before we get started, I have a big favor to ask. If you love what we do, perhaps the number one thing you can do to help us is subscribe wherever you listen. If you're on Apple Podcasts, the app that's on the iPhone or iPad or iTunes or Google Play or wherever it may be, if you subscribe, that shows them, hey, I like this show. They bump us up in the charts. People see us. We get more listeners. Everybody's happy. So please, if you enjoy this show, I hope that you will do that. Now, I think you will enjoy this week's episode because we have two great guests. They've been on the shows before, Nick Redfern many times. Nicholas is a newer guest, but this is his second appearance. So we'll get started with Nick Redfern on the Roswell UFO Conspiracy. If you look at the subject of UFOs, one incident looms large, and it almost sucks all the oxygen out of the room for everything else. And I'm talking about Roswell, of course. And we are going to do a show about Roswell, but maybe we're going to go in a little bit different direction with it than you might assume. Our guest is one of our favorite guests and one of the most prolific authors on the Fortean, on the strange, who is currently on the planet, and that is Nick Redfern. And he has a new book out, which is a follow-up of one of his previous books, and it's called The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, Exposing a Shocking and Sinister Secret. Now, if you know Nick at all, you know he is super prolific. I think he's up to 42, 43 books, somewhere around there. Nick, correct me if I'm wrong. He's been on many, many television programs, radio shows, and we're glad to have him back on the show. Nick, welcome back to the program today.
Hey, Jim. Well, thanks for having me on again.
Now, there have been so many books about Roswell, so many, I've got to believe it's into millions of words written. So I guess the question is, why another Roswell book? Why now? Where does this kind of pick up where I know one of your previous books covered some of this ground? Where does it pick up, and why did you decide to go forward with this at this time?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of, when you talk about why Roswell, I think it's because, what else can be said about it? I think the thing that intrigues people so much about the Roswell case and why it's been put on such a pedestal is because it's not like a one-person case or even a 10-person case, It's a case that really, if you look at the first, second, and third-hand witnesses combined, you're talking about hundreds of people. So I think that's why it's been sort of elevated to the number one UFO case. Now, again, whichever side of the fence you sit on with regard to what happened at Roswell or what didn't happen, there's always new material coming out, even if it's sort of a story that was told to somebody's granddaughter, by the grandfather 50 years ago or 40 years ago, and they've kept quiet on it. Things like that still come out. Mm-hmm. But over the years of doing research into Roswell, time and again, I would get stories that push the case sort of away from the extraterrestrial angle and more down the path of sort of a dark and disturbing series of what we would call sort of human experiments in the early years of rocketry in the post-Second World War era. And the more I dug into this, the more strands and threads I got. And then in 2005, I wrote a book on the data that I'd uncovered called Body Snatchers in the Desert. And a sequel to that book, which sort of updates everything that's come along since 2005, just come out, called the Roswell UFO Conspiracy. That kind of takes it to sort of the next level of what I've found. And I always sort of preface this by saying that, you know, I'm a full unbeliever in the existence of a real UFO phenomenon. There's no doubt about that in my mind at all, that there's a real UFO phenomenon. But I'm not convinced that an aspect of that phenomenon crashed at Roswell. Now, of course, when you look at the UFO community, Roswell is not just the most popular case. It's also the case that has been sort of elevated to a point where it is the number one case. And that's kind of dangerous when you do that, because, yes, if it's proved that Roswell is extraterrestrial, then ufology would be quite rightly congratulating itself and the world would be amazed. If, after elevating Roswell to number one, however, and it collapses as a UFO event, right, then it could actually have a spiraling effect on ufology. You know, morale drops, interest drops. People think, well, if Roswell turns out not to be a UFO and it's the best case, what does it mean about all the rest? So I think there's a danger in making Roswell, quote, the best case. We should just look at all the data on its merits and then just see where this data goes. And if it is a UFO event, fine. And if it isn't, well, we should still be willing to accept that and you know, and move on, really.
Now, the thing that is really compelling to me about the Roswell case is that, you know, the smoking gun, where they said there was the big bold headlines like they used to have in those days about the flying disc and so forth. I think it was a Roswell Daily Record, if I remember correctly. And to me, that's kind of the smoking gun. And then they come back and say the next day, oh, nothing to see here. We were just joking. It was just a weather balloon. So it seems to me pretty evident that something was being covered up. But even if something was being covered up, it doesn't necessarily need to be extraterrestrial, does it?
No, and I think one of the things people often forget when, you know, there was that headline, they found a flying disc, and then, no, sorry, it was a weather balloon. A lot of people forget the context of the time. I mean, bear in mind that when they announced that they found a flying disc at Roswell, this was only 2 weeks after the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which was the first UFO sighting of the modern era. So in other words, you imagine, from our perspective today, we've got 70 years of looking back and studying UFO reports and knowing what the term UFO and flying saucer implies. You imagine if we lived in a world today where there was the word UFO didn't exist, there was no context or issue, you know, relating to flying saucers at all, and then suddenly somebody sees something in the sky, and then 2 weeks after, you know, something allegedly crashes. Well, you imagine that having no history of the UFO phenomenon, but except for 2 weeks, that's all the people had, you know, all around the world. So, in other words, there was actually no real consensus 2 weeks after the Kenneth Arnold sighting what flying discs were. You know, there was no history of alien abductions and Area 51 and all these kind of things. It was just just barely 14 days after the first sighting. So, flying disc back then just meant something unusual in the sky. Today, we perceive it with 70 years of research as an alien spacecraft. And I think that's an important point to note, is that back then in the newspapers, the military was not implying they'd found an alien spacecraft. They were saying that we might have found the remains of what some people are calling these mysterious flying discs, which nobody really has an idea what they are anyway, because they've only just started to be seen. So.
Now, let me ask you this, because this is where some people may take issue. Now, you've had these reports and feedback and case histories of people kind of steering it in this direction or saying things that would lead you to believe that this happened, but it wasn't ET in origin. But what about the reports of people who said it was definitely ET, that they found some kind of weird memory metal that sprung back to life, or the reports of humanoids that look like grays or those kind of things? Are all those people mistaken? Were they lying? I mean, what about the ones that would point to the ET explanation?
Well, yeah, I mean, all these questions obviously need to be answered, but I mean, the interesting thing is, if you look back at the testimony of the people who saw the bodies, although some of them concluded they were alien, if you actually go back and look at the reports, most of them weren't talking about entities that looked like the Greys. You know, they weren't. Yes, they were shorter than average normal height, but they looked quite human. For example, one of the key witnesses to the bodies, a guy named Melvin Brown, he actually went on the record as his family went on the record as saying that he told his family that the bodies that he saw at Roswell, and this is an exact quote, could have passed for Chinese people. You know, so in other words, they were very kind of human-looking. There isn't really a single report where people have said, you know, they had these gigantic black eyes. You know, that's almost like a legend or an assumption that that's what people said, but nobody actually said that. And one of the more telling things as well is that Kevin Randle, who, you know, I consider to be the most sort of level-headed researcher in the pro-UFO aspect of the Roswell investigation, Kevin's latest book on Roswell, he's pretty much walked away from just about all of the alien body stories and the witnesses as, you know, having no sort of real validity. You know, and that's kind of shook up certain factions of ufology, thinking, wow, you know, Kevin wrote 3 or 4 books on Roswell, very, you know, sort of not sensationalized, you know, but looking at the facts. And now Kevin's sort of thinking, well, is there really anything to these alien body stories? Now, as far as the strange memory metal's concerned, you know, that is one of the, you know, the sort of the cruxes of this particular story. But, I mean, a lot of people don't realize one particular thing is that in the post-war era, a lot of the balloons that were used, that were sent up, were polythene balloons, and you know, people would see them all the time, and people would find them, and they would recognize it for what it was. But in sort of 46, 47, research began on making sturdier balloons where they were polythene, but they were laminated with aluminum. And laminated balloons laminated with aluminum, when you wad them up, they don't sort of stay wadded like a piece of paper. They go back, you know, to their original form. Now, granted, people have said that, well, you know, when this memory metal was scrunched up together, it sprung back and there was not a crease or a line or anything in it at all. And that is not exactly how, you know, the polythene balloons coated with aluminum would spring back. But it would return to its original shape. Now, if you hadn't seen that before, you'd only ever seen regular polythene balloons, then it's possible that having seen that for the first time, you might have thought it was extraordinary if, you know, it was a huge balloon laminated with aluminum. And so, again, the time frame is interesting of when these laminated balloons were released. I said sort of 46, 47. And they were very rarely seen because it was a new technology. So, you know, you could add that into the mix to explain the memory metal, and then sort of 30, 40 years later when people are interviewed, because bear in mind, the event happened, but nobody was interviewed about the case till the mid-70s. You know, it's almost 30 years later. So, you know, memories can change. You know, you know, people, I don't dispute they saw wreckage that, you know, that you could wad up and it would spring back. But that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, it was extraterrestrial material. It could just be that people remembered seeing this such odd material because it was new, that the military was using on their balloons at that time. So my personal view, which was outlined, I should say detailed in Body Snatchers and then followed up with the new book, is that what came down was the result of high-altitude balloon experiments where the military was needing and looking into the issue of high altitude exposure, how the human body responds to high altitudes, but also this was tying in with the testing of new technologies and rockets and things like this. And the story that I got from a bunch of old timers who said they could tell the real story of what happened was that a lot of massive balloon experiments, when I say massive, I mean, like huge balloon arrays were secretly flown late at night in New Mexico from various military installations. And in some cases, they had these so-called lifting bodies attached to them, which would have crews inside. And in some cases, they were just huge balloons that had sort of guinea pig human test subjects in them, and that several of these massive balloon / lifting bodies crashed, and military got out there, covered everything up, scooped up the bodies of the people, and scooped up as much as possible all this sort of balloon wreckage that was strewn across the ground. And that one of these events led to the legend of the Roswell case, and that the military decided then, because the rancher got to the crash site first, and so the whistle was blown, so to speak, before the military could keep it under wraps, they decided to then try and hide it all by a series of cover stories, weather balloons, crash test dummies, UFOs, anything to keep people away from the darker and more disturbing theory of early controversial human experimentation in high altitudes and things like that.
Now, here's the question. Let's say that's absolutely correct, and it does seem like a plausible explanation. Why not, obviously, in 1948 or 1958 or even 1968? But when people started asking about this in the 70s and it really hit through the 80s, 90s to today, I know that the government came out and tried to explain this as a series. I believe the Mogul program tried to explain it as an experiment with dummies and so forth. But if these were humans, I mean, there's no one alive who was responsible for this testing. And even if and it's been known that, for example, the military did experiments, unethical experiments with people with LSD and so forth. So what would be the harm of the U.S. government saying in 1995, coming out and saying, look, this was authorized, it is a grievous wrong, we had human subjects, they were put in great danger, they ended up dying. So yes, Roswell happened. Here's the full explanation, not some doublespeak. These were test dummies of some type. Why didn't they just do that if that's the case?
Yeah, well, that's actually a question I asked the various people I interviewed, and they pretty much all had the same response. The fact that it wasn't so much that, they were keeping Roswell hidden, but releasing, as you said, stories about other kind of unethical events that happened in the same time frame. The primary reason, they all said, was because a lot of these balloon operations were based on blueprints and, in some cases, working examples of huge balloons that the Japanese were building in the final stages of the Second World War. Now, to understand the context, in the months leading up to before Nagasaki and Hiroshima were bombed, the atomic bombs in 1945, it ended the war, the Japanese were sending over these small balloon bombs, as they were known, called Fugo balloons. And they're about sort of 30-foot diameter. And they would they would sort of sail, I should say, across the Pacific, calibrated so where they would come down over the United States. And at random locations, and the Japanese hoped, the bombs on board would blow up and kill people or start forest fires. And so it was more like a psychological weapon.
Right.
But towards the very end of the war, the Japanese started boasting as to how they were starting to build these massive balloon arrays with gondolas that could actually carry Japanese crews across the across the Pacific, and really sort of, wreak terror on the United States. It's not unlike we're seeing now, with these stories about how North Korea can,
yes.
A missile can reach Seattle. It's kind of like that,
right.
Like psychological fear. But what happened at the end of the Second World War was that, there was Operation Paperclip, which secretly brought over the German scientists, and that's in the public domain now. But a lot of the stuff that the Japanese are doing with balloons and high-altitude research was done by a group called Unit 731, which was they were like dangerous, crazed Dr. Frankenstein types who performed just terrible experiments on people. But some of this tied in with their high-altitude balloon research. Now, everybody told me that when the war ended, yes, the German scientists came over, which was controversial, but they just worked in the field of rocketry. But some of the people, the Japanese people brought over on like a Japanese equivalent of Paperclip, they were working, in tandem with these Unit 731 people, and it was perceived, probably correctly by the military, that they concluded there's no way we could ever tell people that we did a deal with the Japanese at the end of the Second World War and brought over scientists who not working in the field of rocketry, but actually in the field of human experimentation. And so the whole thing was hidden and buried by the people involved. Now, the other part of the story is that just about everybody interviewed said that because these experiments were sort of perceived as being, at the very least, kind of semi-illegal and definitely unethical, that to protect the guilty, that all the files were shredded or burned or destroyed, and of course there would be no point in keeping balloon wreckage, or even the bodies of the people, because the experiments, they said, really didn't achieve that much because there were a lot of problems with the program. So everything was destroyed, and all we have today are sort of legends and words, word of mouth, that kind of thing. Now, of course, if it was a UFO crash, then everything would have been preserved, the bodies, the wreckage. There would be probably millions of pages of material on autopsies and studies of the memory metal. But you can well understand that if it was just sort of a domestic but very disturbing and controversial series of experiments, you could understand how those involved, if they started to get panicky that, they might get into problems, that they might just destroy everything, destroy the files, burn them. And, if that is true, it's possible that today there is no way to 100% prove what happened. It may just be, the legend passed down to the point where we hit that brick wall because the evidence doesn't exist. So I think the only chance we have of the evidence existing is if it was extraterrestrial. If it's the other angle, it's a case of just destroy it all. So we may, if it was a domestic experiment, we may not actually be able to ever prove it, if everything was shredded or whatever.
Our guest is Nick Redfern. We're talking about his new book, The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, and we'll be back right after this on the Paranormal Podcast. The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Gaia, the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. And keep listening, because I'm going to tell you how you can get your first month for only 99 cents. Now, we all know those big-name streaming TV services with movies and TV shows, but until Gaia, there wasn't a streaming service solely dedicated to the topics we love, the kind of topics you hear on this show. But now there is. And even better, you can watch Gaia on all of your devices. There's Apple TV, your iPhone, your iPad, your Chromecast, your Android device, phone or tablet, your Fire TV, your computer. Basically, if you're listening to this podcast, you can watch Gaia. Now, Gaia explores the topics we love, and they're always providing viewers with tremendous new content. For example, here's some of the things you'd be missing this week if you're not a part of Gaia. Buzzsaw, hosted by Sean Stone, welcomes Richard Beaumont, and he's going to talk about human design, discovering your purpose. And then we've got Cosmic Disclosure, and this one looks really interesting, hosted by David Wilcock and Corey Good. They're going to talk about Boyd Bushman's deathbed testimonial. They're going to analyze footage from Bushman's testimony, which highlights secret reverse engineering programs and details alien physiology. If you're interested in discovering the truth about ET, that's a great one to take a look at. And, of course, Beyond Belief, hosted by George Norrie, the Mojave abduction incident. Ron Felber is the guest there. And so much more at Gaia. I think you're absolutely going to love it. That's why you need to go over to the page I created just for me. And just this week, we got a little revision up there at Gaia.com/Jim. And they said, Jim, pick out some shows that you think your audience might like on UFOs and different things. So I went in and I picked out some shows on UFOs, haunted places, and Bigfoot, just to name a few things. A few things I thought you really might like. So go to Gaia.com/Jim. That's GAIA.com/Jim. Check it out. Checking that out is absolutely free, and you can get a flavor of what you'll get with Gaia. And I know if you like this show, you're going to love Gaia. There's nothing like it. It's a video buffet for the topics we love. So go to Gaia.com/Jim, and more importantly, once you've gotten there and you've sampled some of the content, there's various places on the page you can click and join up for only 99 cents for your first month. Isn't that a great deal? 99 cents, so you can get a little toe into the water with just the free content and then dip a little further, get that 99-cent deal. I'm sure you're going to like it. Now, Gaia has been great about helping us and supporting us over the last several months. They help make this show possible because nothing we do here is free. You know, we have bandwidth costs and server costs, and I have people that help me out, and all of these things cost money, and it's because of people like Gaia that we're able to do this. So I want you to show them your support and go over to Gaia.com/Jim. That's GAIA.com/Jim and sign up for that 99 cents. See what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. Thanks, Gaia. Our guest is Nick Redfern. The book is The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, and so much to delve into here. One thing that caught my eye here in the table of contents, we talked about the Japanese balloons, but you talked about John Keel and the Japanese balloons, and that interests me, obviously, John Keel of Mothman Prophecies fame. Yeah. Where did John Keel come into the picture of this?
Well, actually, that's a good point, because a lot of people said when the first book came out, Body Snatchers, in 2005, and now, even with the new one now, people have said, you know, it's Nick Redfern's story, Nick Redfern's theory. Well, it actually isn't. There's quite a few people, excuse me, and organisations who were given snippets of the same story as me, but, you know, they didn't write books on it. So I guess I can understand why people sort of focus on, you know, my aspect of investigating this. But, I mean, just quickly before we get to Keel, in 1997, Popular Mechanics magazine, which is a well-respected newsstand magazine, Popular Mechanics published an article stating that they had been told of a forthcoming release of files that would have told the story, or that would tell the story of a Japanese equivalent to Operation Paperclip, and that the craft would be shown to have been this huge balloon array and this lifting body type craft held beneath it, and that the bodies were essentially Japanese crewmen brought over from Japan, kind of in a similar fashion to Operation Paperclip. Now, those files didn't surface, but somebody on the inside did tell Popular Mechanics that, you know, somebody was lobbying or pushing to get this material released. So that suggests a possibility that not all the files were destroyed. Some of them may still be around. Now, as far as Keel's concerned, he wrote a number of articles between 1990 and 1993 for Fate magazine, and they're all focused on, you know, what came down at Roswell. Keel, in his articles, talked about how he had spoken to a number of people who seemed to have, who weren't involved in Roswell, but they had been involved in or had seen evidence of a previous one of these flights, which again ended badly, but in the California desert, something being tested out there. And they said it was, again, like a Japanese balloon, a huge Japanese balloon with a Japanese crew. And as time went on, and Keel wrote more articles, in the end he got 4 or 5 different sources on independent events, again talking about this angle of the legends of, as they were called back then. So, if you look at some of the early books and articles on crashed UFOs, they use the term, there were little people found in these UFOs with Oriental type appearances. That was the wording they used back then, unfortunately. But and if you look at some of these reports, and you talk about how the Japanese, that when they were boasting about sending these manned balloons over, American intelligence learned that they were talking about, finding the smallest crews, guys who are like 5 feet tall, because it would allow for, less weight in the gondola, etc., etc. So, you put all that together, huge balloons, lifting bodies, small pilots, and coming over, the Pacific to Japan, etc., to the United States from Japan, and then the experiments being continued in the post-war era, you can see how, some of this could be placed into like a UFO context, a crashed UFO context, 30 or 40 years after the event actually occurred.
Now, something else that interests me, and I believe this might get to some of the things that Annie Jacobsen has talked about in her books, this idea of Soviet mutants and Area 51. Where does that come into play?
Well, yeah, I talk about Annie Jacobsen briefly in my book, only because, I don't endorse that theory, because her theory, I think, just didn't hold merit. The reason being that she was talking about Joseph Stalin doing a deal with Mengele, Joseph Mengele, who's sort of one of the most deranged, insane, evil characters, in the history of the Second World War. But he fled to South America. So, the idea of him actually being able to work in 1947 with Stalin in Russia just doesn't make sense. And of course, the other angle is that, in her book, the story that was told to her by a genuinely retired source who had links to Area 51. He wasn't like a whistleblower, so to speak. Although he didn't speak out, on the record, eventually his name did become public. So in other words, he wasn't just somebody in the shadows, so to speak. But what's particularly interesting about all this is the fact that Jacobson's source claimed that with Mengele and the Soviets, they'd actually sort of genetically altered children to make them look like aliens, and so it'd be like a fake War of the Worlds, Orson Welles kind of hysteria, fear kind of situation. But there's just no way back in the 40s that we were able to sort of genetically alter people's appearances, That's just not feasible. It's not really feasible today. So I think, but I mention that because, that the angle of secret experiments, so I included that in the book to demonstrate that there are actually other theories that relate to secret experiments and Roswell beyond just the one that I talk about. And, I've always freely admitted that, people have said, well, how do you know you weren't fed disinformation? And my honest answer is that I don't know that I wasn't fed disinformation. But when you see that there are threads to this story that go back decades, like John Keel finding information, Popular Mechanics in 1997 giving the same story. One of the other things I found intriguing is that, back in 1997, Colonel Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, came out, which, promotes the UFO angle. But what's intriguing is that one of Corso's closest friends and also a colleague within the military was a high-ranking officer named Charles Willoughby. Now, Charles Willoughby was the guy who secretly oversaw the transfer of all the Unit 731 material from Japan to the United States. He ran that program. So if there was a Unit 731 link to Roswell, he would have known about it. And the fact that he was a very, very close friend and worked within the military and after retirement with Corso, that makes me wonder if Corso knew the real story or the human experiment story and perhaps, aggressively promoted the alien angle to steer away from, what he actually knew about the other angle of it all.
Now, I have to ask you this. What has been the reaction? I mean, are some people saying, oh, Nick has fallen for a psyop, and he's been fooled by the powers that be and he's been tricked? Or are other people saying, yeah, I think you're onto something? What has been the reaction, pro and con?
Well, it actually is pretty much both those two scenarios. There's not really much room for anything in between. There aren't many people who are kind of like, well, it could go both ways, or I'm not sure. Most people have an opinion that either it is the real answer or it is disinformation. There's nobody who's as far as I know at least, who is kind of, straddling the fence and doesn't know which way to go. And of course, one of the things that is inevitable, because this is ufology, people, emotions get involved, and instead of just looking at the facts and the data, it then becomes like a personal attack on me. So then I just personally attack back, But that's ufology. But what this demonstrates is the emotional factor that is sort of inextricably tied to Roswell, that it's because everybody's kind of put their eggs in one basket, that this is a case that's going to prove everything. All we need is the files, or all we need is a body, or photographs, or, material that cannot be denied, and then we've won the battle. But, like I said, you put all your eggs in one basket, you're in danger of breaking them all if it collapses. So I think that's why so many people reacted. If I'd written a book, say, on the Socorro case of 1964, or on flying triangles, and I said flying triangles were secret military aircraft and not UFOs, there wouldn't be an uproar, because the flying triangle angle hasn't been elevated to the number one aspect of ufology. It's kind of the parallel would be, writing a book and saying that the Patterson film of Bigfoot from '67 is garbage. The Bigfoot community would be up in arms, as it has been, for daring to say that, because that footage is perceived as the best evidence of Bigfoot.
It's the holy relic.
And I think, and that's the problem. With the not so much the problem with the book, but the problem with the reaction is that very often people react in the way they do because they have an emotional tie to Roswell, and I think everybody to a degree has emotional ties and belief systems. That's what makes us human. We wouldn't be human if we didn't think like that to a degree. But on the other hand, I think we should try and be impartial and just look at Roswell as a mystery to be solved, not as a case to try and bolster the ETH of ufology,
Well, it's almost kind of like, I think some people consider it like the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you kind of put, you say that's not real, then Christianity kind of falls apart. I think people think that about Roswell, but to your point earlier, that's not necessarily the case, because even if this was not of ET origin, it does not mean that other sightings are also of human origin. It doesn't speak to all of the cases. It just speaks to this one case.
Yeah, you're right. And that's also one of the big problems I've found, that so many people cannot extract Roswell from the greater UFO phenomenon. It's like the two are sort of super glued together. There's just no way to remove them. But I always say to people, just because I question what happened at Roswell, there's no doubt in my mind at all that there's a real UFO phenomenon. You know, it was through my dad's experience as a radar mechanic in the military, the British military, and he was involved in several radar-based UFO events. That's what got me interested, and they clearly weren't, you know, military aircraft. I'm a believer in the abduction phenomenon. The Men in Black mystery, I'm firmly convinced the Men in Black are real, but they're not even, you know, they're not from the government. They're something extraterrestrial or paranormal. So, you know, I'm a full-on believer in the existence of a real UFO phenomenon, but I'm just not convinced that an aspect of that phenomenon crashed at Roswell. So, in other words, if one case collapses, ufology shouldn't collapse. But when you elevate it so high, Roswell actually does present a potential danger for that exact scenario actually happening.
And then I would say, on the other hand, and maybe this is part of the reason for the visceral reaction, or at least a piece of it, is that if Roswell is proven to have just been a horribly gone wrong experiment of the U.S. military, then you'll have the debunkers saying, aha, there's nothing to any of this.
Well, that's right. You know, it's, you know, you will have that angle. If the best case as it's perceived falls apart, what does that mean about the rest of them? Well, actually, it shouldn't, at least. It shouldn't have any bearing on the other cases. What we should do is just look at all them impartially and as a single case. You know, I think that's an important thing, or important way of looking at it, is just to look at each case on its own merit. And that goes also for the debunkers and the skeptics. You know, just because one case may not stand up after so many years, that doesn't mean that somehow magically that another case doesn't have merit. That's just, you know, an assumption and lazy journalism, really. So, and some people, of course, have just suggested, you know, oh well, you know, the story is just going to confuse things even more. Well, yes, actually it will, but that doesn't, just because it's going to confuse things rather than give people what they want, that doesn't mean you shouldn't put the story out there for people to see. And that's the main reason why I put the book out, was because with Roswell, whichever side of the fence you're on, we've kind of reached this sort of stalemate/brick wall where it's so long ago, pretty much everybody's dead, and where do we go from here? And I think by putting the story out, if there are people who can confirm it, who are still alive, or, you know, who have inherited the files in the government, you know, for years after, maybe somebody will come forward and say what they know about it. And so that's why I think it's important to get a story out there to try and see if we can bring in new threads and leads, because when you hit that brick wall, like, you know, Roswell's like a Jack the Ripper kind of case where it's an interesting old mystery with lots of theories, but everybody's gone, and how do we take it further? And so for me, we take it further by putting out there what we know and see what the feedback is, and hopefully the feedback might open another door and another door, you know.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think it adds more credence to those interested in UFOs if they actually take a look at this kind of a case and are willing to say, maybe it's not what we thought it was. Doesn't mean we're throwing a baby out with the bathwater here, but we're willing to take a look at this honestly, intellectually, and I think that actually strengthens the work of UFO researchers. So it's like if somebody, you know, gave me a UFO story, a Roswell story tomorrow that was definitively based around the alien angle. You know, would I interview that person extensively? Yeah, of course I would. You know, I'm not going to shy away from investigating something that pushes Roswell down another path, you know, because I'm interested in solving what happened at Roswell. I'm not interested in upholding theories just because ufology finds them exciting. You know, that's not the way to do it. So. Well, I think if you're interested in Roswell and UFOs, certainly this is something you should take a look at, even if you kind of think, I'm not too sure about this. Read and decide for yourself. So if people want to do that, Nick, where can they connect to this book and everything else you do?
Okay. Well, the new book's called The Roswell UFO Conspiracy. It's just been out about 3-4 weeks, and it's available on Amazon, or you could order it from Barnes & Noble. And people can reach me at my blog, which is Nick Redfern 14, F-O-R-T-E-A-N, nickredfern14.blogspot.com, or you can find me on Twitter and Facebook as well.
Well, the book is The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, Exposing a Shocking and Sinister Secret. Our guest has been Nick Redfern. Nick, thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Always great to catch up with Nick, a fantastic guest, and he always brings the goods, and he always has good stuff to bring. And we have a newer friend who is coming up next after this message, Nicholas Pearson. He's going to talk to us about crystals for karmic healing. Transform your future by releasing your past. And he'll be here right after this. The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Wink. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced great wine. I love it because until Wink, they used to be called Club W, but before these guys came along, wine kind of intimidated me, but no longer the case. I enjoy wine, and this is a great time of the year because we're coming up on the summer, and you're going to have friends over, you're going to entertain, and wouldn't it be nice to have several bottles of wine at the ready and kind of make you look like a connoisseur, but you're just learning through Wink? That's why I love it so much, because Wink custom tailors wines to your tastes and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus a flat $6 shipping rate. All you have to do, you don't have to know anything about wine. I didn't know anything about wine. Visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz to get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. You tell them, they ask you, do you like to eat this? Do you like this taste? Do you like that taste? And then it spits out a recommendation, and it's really pretty neat. Now, the price point for most wines is extremely affordable, $13. So by signing up with Wink, you're getting your first bottle for free. Now, Wink is offering our audience members who are 21 and over and who live in the United States a $20 credit plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. And I absolutely love it. I've been enjoying a bottle of One from the Quiver. And they've got these neat kind of funky names, but it's great wine. This wine actually is from Argentina. And very, very neat stuff. So I want you to try it. I think you will enjoy it. It's great for entertaining. I love it. And now I feel like I'm building up a little bit of a collection. Very affordable. And when friends come over, and I can offer a bottle of wine, and it's not things that you regularly see in the stores either. So that's kind of cool too. And if you go over to the Wink website, they give you all this background. You can watch these very concise videos that teach you about the different wines. It's very cool. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order, go to trywink.com/Jim. That's trywinc.com/Jim. I think that you will love it. Thanks, Wink. We have a return guest today. He was so great the first time. We said when we found out he had a new book, absolutely we'll have him back on. I'm talking about Nicholas Pearson, and he does have a new book out. It is called Crystals for Karmic Healing, Transform Your Future by Releasing Your Past. And Nicholas has been immersed in all aspects of the mineral kingdom for more than 20 years. He began teaching crystal workshops in high school, later studying mineral science at Stetson University while pursuing a degree in music. A certified teacher of Reiki, he teaches crystal and Reiki classes throughout the United States. He is also the author of the 7 Archetypal Stones, and he lives in Orlando, Florida. Nicholas, welcome back to the program today.
Thank you so much for having me back, Jim. It's my pleasure.
A little bit before we got started, we were talking about your previous book, which we had you on the show for in this book. And you were kind of explaining the idea of this book. This seems to be a book for pretty much everyone. And not that your other book wasn't, but this book is very accessible, it sounds like, to everybody to kind of harness this power of crystals.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted it to be really lavishly illustrated so that way it can help people identify their stones. Since there are a lot more rocks in it than in the first book, that's really a necessity. It's much easier to just describe 7 stones and put one picture of each one in the book than it is to have a compendium of 50, 60 stones, and I wanted to have that difference in there.
This is really interesting to me, and you would have no way of knowing this, but actually going to conferences and things, I've started to, when I go there are people who are rock dealers and so forth, and they'll be there, and I'll always come back with a stone. So I have a few stones right here. I have an amethyst skull, and I have a golden stone, and I have a green one that I can't remember what it is. But anyway, so I've actually taken a little toe into the water, a dip into the water of these things. Now, what amazes me, for example, I'm looking at this amethyst skull. I mean, what imbues a stone with different energetic properties than another stone? I mean, to me, I would just say it's a pretty piece of rock. But what is the mechanism? Because that whole idea that this stone does this and the next stone does that, that's fascinating to me. I mean, what is the mechanism? How does that work?
That's a really great question. My little PSA that goes beforehand is a lot of this material, though it may sound very scientific, hasn't been in a peer-reviewed journal, hasn't really been extensively or exhaustively studied in the lab. But I'm going to use as much science as we can to describe how this works, within reason, of course.
Sure.
And what it comes down to is all things are comprised of particles that are in motion. And if we even break those down, eventually we see that things can be kind of, particle-like or wave-like. We are both matter and energy simultaneously. And in living systems like a human being or a cow or a plant or anything else, the sort of spectrum in our energy makeup, the measurable part of our energy fields. We don't even have to go into the paranormal to describe this. It's just what we can get with equipment. But the range of frequencies that we emit is not necessarily very consistent at any moment. What we're exhibiting on that energy spectrum is a function of what we think, how we feel, what we're eating, what we're wearing, where we are, who we're with, and so on and so forth. But when we look at something like a rock or a mineral, they have such precise, regular compositions, very predictable and repeatable structures, and this inner and outer perfection that generates a field of energy with a property called coherence, which means that all those frequencies, all those wavelengths that it emits, essentially they march in step. They're perfectly synchronized. So the things that make one mineral different from another in terms of their properties are largely a result of its composition, the ingredients that go into it, the crystal class, the way those atoms, ions, and molecules are arranged into a geometric form, and the morphology, the way that inner form is reflected in the outer form. And some of the secondary things that kind of come into play are, for example, hardness, mass, density, diaphaneity, whether or not it's transparent, translucent, or opaque, and even color to a lesser degree. So, all of these things influence that spectrum of energy that it emits around it, and therefore when we interact with it, it's training our energy field to be more coherent in the way that it is.
Now, in the title, Crystals for Karmic Healing, how does karma play into crystals? What is the importance of karma in all of this? I mean, there's a huge section, first section of the book, that's dedicated to the concept of karma. It's a big part of the book. And throughout you have the karmic toolkit, working with karma, the lords of karma, understanding karma. And then if I look at a gemstone or a crystal, I don't necessarily think of karma. So where does karma come into play with all of this?
Well, we live in such an interesting time that, the easiest and briefest way to state it. But one of the reasons that so much is coming to a head so quickly is because that for as long as we've been on Earth, as a race, as a people, we've been accumulating karma, which is nothing more than, the record of cause and effect. The law of karma, it doesn't say that something is out to get you. It's just a measurement of cause and effect. And so much of the healing that I've been seeing going on the deepest level relates back to our sort of karmic pattern. And I'm a crystal guy. My way of relating to the world is often through the lens of the mineral kingdom. And I started to notice that some of the deeper work that I was doing with crystals related to this karmic level, but there was no manual to teach people how to do that. So I wanted to give a really fresh perspective on working with crystals. So that way it's, one more series of tools in someone's toolkit. But when we look at a mineral, the only karma that it is effectively generated is to be present. Everything else is an act of service or merit, which generates positive karma. So literally just being in the presence of something beautiful and crystalline is exposing us to a radiant energy field of positive karma, which, therefore theoretically trains our energy field to want to do the same thing. And, there are some stones that are a little bit more qualified to do this than others, while all crystals have that sort of service-oriented role. Others really dig deep and become karmic healing tools.
Now, this is going to kind of sound like a mundane question, but I think it is a concern. When people hear crystals, they assume expense. How can I even start with this? I mean, these gemstones are so expensive, but are there gemstones that you cover in the book that are more accessible and inexpensive that people can work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first and foremost, we shouldn't have to break the bank to make ourselves well, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. And especially in the spiritual realm where we can't, really get reimbursed through insurance in most cases. One of the things that we can do is look for, I don't want to say quick and easy fixes, but effective and economic. And some crystals are naturally, some mineral specimens are going to be pricey. There's no way around it, especially when you talk about the precious gemstones. They're expensive. So gem quality diamond, maybe not in everybody's budget, but you can certainly get tiny fragments of diamonds on the internet that are maybe not gem quality and certainly aren't faceted, but they have that diamond energy and they can do the job. Other things are a lot more abundant, things like carnelian, apophyllite, amethyst, amazonite. These are covered in the book, and they're something that we can really all afford. We might get a small piece, we might get a huge piece. The size, the shape, the nature of the tool is up to you. So you really get a lot of opportunity to personalize your toolbox that way.
Now, when we talk about working with these gemstones, what do we mean? What kind of, and I know there's a number of modalities, but what are some of the kind of examples of things that we can do with these crystals?
The simplest and probably most effective thing that we can do is just begin a regular contemplation practice. It doesn't even have to be a formal meditation, but setting aside some quiet time with the stone that you want to use and just connect to it sincerely with an open heart. Don't have any expectation, no agenda, no attachment to a specific outcome, and just be present with it. And, that isn't something we all make time for, so there are more passive ways that we can harness the energy of stones. We can wear them, we can carry them in our pockets, we can take them to bed with us and have them under the pillow or on the nightstand or under the bed even. And we can also use them in a therapeutic setting, which is, the formal idea of crystal healing or gemstone therapy that some of us kind of picture when we think of crystals. You could make crystal grids, you can place them on, sort of therapy windows or specific zones on the body that have, regular and predictable therapeutic outcomes. The other thing that we can do is sort of engage them into our daily life, make a ritual of it, whether it's the idea of programming a gemstone in order to imbue it with an intent, or leaving it in your sacred space, your altar, or your desk, wherever you're going to be, having it in your energy field and being conscious and aware of its presence and, really sincerely connecting to it. That's when we get the result. It doesn't have to be the same for everyone. You can really personalize it and make it your own.
When we talk about healing, what kinds of healing are we talking about? Are we talking mental, physical, spiritual, a combination of all of them? What exactly are we talking about when we're talking about karmic healing?
Karma is this thing that is woven into every fiber of our being. So, an example from my own life that is very physically oriented. Several years back, I was in a motorcycle accident, totaled the bike, and broke one of my knees and, banged and bruised other parts of me. And for a very long time, I would experience residual physiological effects, even though my doctor was astonished at how quickly I'd healed. And, part of that was the sort of cellular memory, if you will, of that trauma. And so by releasing the karmic layer of that, releasing the record of it from my karmic patterning, I've actually been able to release a lot of that physiological pain. But in other ways, we experience karma through our emotions, through our thoughts, or even just through the evolution of our soul. Not something we can see in the here and now necessarily at all times, but affects the big outcome of where we are and where we're going.
Now, I want to be very clear about this because anytime we talk about physical healing, I just want to make sure I have the perspective of the guest in regard to this. Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about crystals for healing, are you talking about a supplement to traditional medicine, a replacement for traditional medicine? What are your thoughts on that particular question?
I believe all these sort of body, mind, spirit therapies should be integrative. They should complement our traditional care. They're not something that we generally should replace. I mean, that's up to you, but always be smart about it. In any sort of therapy protocol that I'm engaged with myself, with friends or clients, they really ought to be working with their primary care physician or other provider. So I don't think it's wise for us to replace, especially if you have a serious condition. But there are a lot of minor things that if we use the right kind of approach, we can take care of preventively. And that's one of the things that, the realm of crystal healing is very good with.
Yes, I agree with you in regards to using it as a supplement. For me, it gets a little frightening when people say, well, throw away all your medicine and just use whatever this modality is. That gets scary to me. I'm not a physician. I'm not a medical expert, but if someone to risk to me, I look at all these things as supplemental and integrated. And it's interesting. We just talked to a physician who had these great stories of supernatural things that have happened. He's very much a traditional physician. And we were talking about that and about the idea of supplementary care as opposed to kind of tossing out traditional medicine, because traditional medicine can hold a lot of great things for us. But to me, adding on these modalities, it can't hurt a thing. And I think in many times it probably can help. So I just like to always be very clear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think energy medicine, which includes things like Reiki and acupuncture and crystal healing and many other varieties of healing, may be the future we're aspiring toward, but I don't think we'll ever get away from allopathic care. I think that the two work together so synergistically that it's always a great idea to use them in tandem.
Well, we are going to talk more about crystals for karmic healing. Transform your future by releasing your past. And our guest is Nicholas Pearson. And we'll be back right after this.
If you like the Paranormal Podcast, you'll want to check out Jim's other free podcasts. Be sure to tune in to Crime Scene and Jim Harold's Campfire. You can find them at jimharold.com and wherever fine podcasts are heard. Check them out. Bet you can't listen to just one. Now, we return to the Paranormal Podcast.
We're back on the Paranormal Podcast. Our guest today is Nicholas Pearson. We're talking about his recent book, Crystals for Karmic Healing. Transform your future by releasing your past. Now, Nicholas, really, I've got to say this book is beautifully illustrated. You've got great photos here throughout, not just one little section, but throughout, and you kind of show these different crystals and talk about their properties and what they can be used for. What are a couple of your favorites and what do they do?
My all-time favorite mineral, which, found its way into this book, I guess I should say gemstone in this case, is petersite. Petersite is a member of the quartz family, and it's sometimes called the tempest stone. And when you look at polished specimens of it, it looks like swirling storm clouds. Just stunning. Been in love with it since I was a kid. And in terms of, its karmic components, one of the things that it does is it really shakes things loose. It's a really transformational kind of stone. So, that stormy quality that we see optically is a clue to its stormy energy and can kind of purge things that are outdated. Just a really, really wonderful stone. Another of my favorite that you can get in all varieties of quality, I guess you could say. So that way there are lots of different price points available for you. There's aquamarine. I think aquamarine is one of those stones that every human being on the face of the planet can benefit from. It works with us, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, karmically. It's just such a vital healer, and it's a member of the beryl family. It's actually a pretty close relative of emerald, and its name literally comes from Latin for seawater because of that sort of aquatic appearance that it's got. But it's a stone of release. So whenever we work with aquamarine, it's that going with the flow kind of lesson, and we kind of learn to go with the tides of life, that coming and going, so we're not always going against the grain. And in terms of karma, that's really beneficial, because if we're trying to work really hard and swim upstream, sometimes we get so exhausted that we just end up making the same mistake, perpetuating the same pattern. When we relax deeply enough in the way that aquamarine allows us to, we can kind of release whatever we're holding on to. So it's very detoxifying. And also it's one of the few stones that can help us tap into our spiritual blueprint. The inner and outer morphology of this stone really relates to that sort of highest spiritual truth, that blueprint or template that Creator makes for everything, from human beings to planets to star systems to tiny little atoms. Every piece of creation has its own blueprint. And when we kind of get stuck in a way of being, it's often because we've lost communication with our blueprints themselves. And aquamarine gives us the liquidity or the fluidity to go between that sort of particle state and where we're expressing a reality and the wave state, when we can return to the perfection of our blueprint, retrieve information, and enact it in the here and now. It's a great one for correcting our course overall. Aqua is so popular that you can find it just about anywhere, from little tiny tumbled stones to exquisite faceted stones. It's just a great tool for all of us.
And maybe that's the answer to my next question. What's a good beginner stone, or maybe more than one good beginner stone, something that's maybe inexpensive, readily available, that's powerful? Is there such a thing? It's kind of like training wheels for this. I mean, is there something, a good one to start with?
Yeah, I'd say amethyst is a great one. So many of us are drawn to the realm of crystals because of the vivid colors, and of all the stones that are pretty readily accessible, amethyst is, the brightest of the purple or violet that we can get, and it's just so potent, so powerful. I mean, it got an entire book, an entire chapter in my last book, Seven Archetypal Stones, so it's a really potent healer on many levels. But the energy of amethyst, it kind of works as the emissary of the archetype of the violet ray, or seventh ray of the Theosophical teachings. And because of that, it embodies this principle of alchemy. So when it comes to our karma, it's really unique. It kind of relates to the symbol of the violet flame. Whatever we put in comes out transmuted, whereas other stones might help to cut through karmic ties or stave off karmic patterns, or even just slow them down. With amethyst, it actually takes it from one side of the scale where our bad karma is and moves it to the positive side. So it's not just releasing old karma, but recycling it into something positive. So I think that's something the world at large needs. We should have streets paved with amethyst. It would be great if we could have buildings erected from it and just sit in that energy of transmutation.
Well, it's interesting. It may be coincidence, but I've had this for about 3 years, and a lot of times when I'm sitting doing podcasts like I am now, I might pick it up and just kind of, like a worry bead, kind of handle it in my hand while I'm talking. And things have really improved the last 2 or 3 years. So with the popularity of the show. So, I'm not saying that's what it is, but, correlation doesn't mean causality, but it is interesting.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When we work with stones, I think some of the mystery that's going on is just that ability to relax, whether it's a tactile cause that's giving us that deep relaxation, or whether it's some sort of spiritual mechanism. I can't say if there's a blanket statement across the board. And when I recently worked with a museum, and we put together a a display featuring the stones in my first book in an Institute of Science. I mean, one of the things that we had to broach early on was how decidedly unscientific a lot of my work is, but at the end of the day, beauty is healing. So, sure, correlation is not causation, but when we relax, we allow for so much better. That whole idea that the medical profession calls positive mental affect. Just by feeling better, it changes our brain chemistry. That changes all sorts of other things going on in our bodies. So I think there's so many levels, so many layers to the way that stones work with us that it's hard to take it to a single mechanism.
Now, this may seem like an odd question, but the beauty of stones and crystals is amazing to me. Now, do you think that it's possible? And some people would call this God. I would call it God. Other people might call it the universe. That some greater being has said, let me make these beautiful objects and create these beautiful crystals and imbue them with such beauty that man will be drawn to them and utilize their power. Now, is that a crazy theory, or do you think there might be something to it?
I think there really is something to this. There are so many myths and legends around the world that sort of address this whole realm of stone and what its role is in supporting life. In some native cultures, they believe that quartz in particular, because of its clarity and its really beautiful prismatic structure, they believe that it is pieces of God or pieces of the gods or the dwelling place of the gods here in the physical, or even sometimes they believe that if our human lives go really well, if we aspire to the pinnacle of creation, the next time we come back embodied in crystal. So I think the whole idea of this relationship between our biological kingdom and then the mineralogical, geological kingdom of stone, we were always meant to be together. One of the current theories of how life actually evolved makes use of tiny nanoparticles of clay that would have been the things that eventually became the first nucleotide bases that would become, the ancestor of DNA, RNA, and eventually the grandfather of all protein synthesis. So I think that the whole kingdom of living things really depends upon that structure of stone, whether it's because it's beautiful or because we're ultimately descended from it in some weird, twisted kind of way. It's just so magical to see that relationship. And, it's intergenerational, it's cross-cultural. You never find a culture that wasn't at least somewhat fascinated by crystals, rocks, gems, minerals, whatever you want to call them.
Something that caught my eye in the book was you talked about crystals and past life regression. How would that work?
So, stones themselves are physical, tangible memories of geological processes. They are the end results of events that happen in and on and around and within our Earth. So, in a way, when we connect to them for past life healing, they can kind of help see what we're experiencing now, how that is actually a product of whatever processes are going on in our life. So some stones are better at this than others. A real simple exercise that's in the book is to locate two energy centers, like portals or windows that are just just behind your ear, rather, on the bony ridge behind them. And if you have a pair of stones that are similar, that work really with the theme of past lives, maybe jade or dumortierite, a fossil of some sort, these would be great to place there and just quietly meditate and see what they might dredge up by placing them on this location. It's a sort of a window, a doorway into our spiritual anatomy that is closely linked to the idea of past lives. So that's a really simple exercise.
What do you think would surprise most people about crystals?
Oh, well, the longer I work with stones, the more surprised I am about how unusual these substances can really be. I think one of the things that has surprised me the most is just when we have something figured out, we always get something new and exciting. So a lot of the stones that we're very familiar with in the world of crystal healing or spirituality, where we engage with stones, we might only see what's commercially available or accessible from one part of the world, but something like quartz comes in so many different shapes and sizes and colors and varieties that it will never end. There's no finite amount of varieties of anything to work with. In fact, a real recent addition to my toolbox is this sort of bright strawberry pink or red apophyllite. And in the book, you can see there's this beautiful white, prismatic, almost silvery kind of apophyllite. And that's what most people think of when they think of this stone, but now we have these brilliant reds coming out of the earth. So I think the earth likes to keep us on our toes. And I also think that these new discoveries tend to coincide with the energies of the time. What we need the most becomes available to us at the right time.
Well, it's very interesting to me, and I'm typically not as given, even though we do cover them, because I think it's a big part of this. The metaphysical side of all of this may be my weakest side in all of these different phenomena and different things that we cover. But the idea of crystals is one that in gemstones really fascinates me, and we've been so glad to have you as a guest now for the second time with this book, Crystals for Karmic Healing. And Nicholas, the question is, where can people find this book and connect with everything you do?
Yeah, so, my books are available wherever books are sold. You can find them online at innertraditions.com or amazon.com. Any other booksellers are likely to carry it. You can visit your local metaphysical store or Barnes & Noble, and you're very likely to find it there. If you'd like to keep track of what I'm doing and where I am, my author page on innertraditions.com is a great place to go. You can also find a similar author page on Amazon with a list of all my events and resources. And then you can find me on Facebook as well. So I'm traveling all over the place to try to put these tools in people's hands. So I look forward to connecting with our listeners in person sometime.
Well, it is a fascinating topic, very interesting stuff. If you're into crystals or into gemstones, please give Nicholas's work a look. The book is Crystals for Karmic Healing, Transform Your Future by Releasing Your Past. Nicholas, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that show as much as I did. Nick and Nicholas were great guests, and we look forward to speaking to them and with them many more times in the future. We thank you so much for tuning in. We certainly appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time on the Paranormal Podcast. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye. Now for the legal disclaimer. We do not accept money from publishers or content producers in exchange for interviews. However, as with most media outlets, in the majority of cases, we do receive complimentary copies of books and DVDs that we feature on our podcasts. Your purchases of books, DVDs, and other items via our Amazon.com links benefit Jim Harold and JimHarold.com and help us continue our programming. The sponsor messages you hear on the programs are paid endorsements, although we really do like them. For the full disclaimer, go to JimHarold.com, and thanks for listening.